Thank you very much, Mohammed, for inviting me, and thanks for all those who are attending. It's a great privilege, really, to share a little bit about my understanding and how social media and media in general works in Somalia. So a quick summary of media landscape in Somalia, and my focus would be the role of social media in Somali's political environment. Now, I will also discuss BBC, VOA Somali, the role of the leaders or people in power in general. We will cover media freedom in the country. So if I start with a bit of a history, after the collapse of central government and the start of Somalia's civil war in the early 90s, media in Somalia was essentially, and still is, essentially unregulated. Some may say that's actually a good thing. You don't want to have a journalist or media outlets under a lot of regulation, but at the same time, a regulation and rule of law within every industry is essential and desirable. So journalists had and still have, to some extent, unrestricted freedom to write and publish stories without editorial oversight. Money take active role in the conflict, and subsequent governments have established and started a regulation. Media law is one of them, but those laws are characterized by the organizations, journalist organizations, as very repressive. Now, Somalia, to some extent, have a vibrant media culture, and it hosts a number of media outlets, private and public, a lot of websites, a lot of blogs. But at the same time, journalists in the country have been subject of killings, attacks, arbitrary arrests, detentions, intimidations, and harassment. And some media outlets have been shut down, and their equipment was confiscated. Now, Somalia didn't have a lot of domestic publication in the previous years, and broadcasting was controlled by the government, and this is true during the military government. There was only one daily newspaper, Hedikt October. A lot of you may remember that, or the October Star. There were a variety of weekly and monthly publications. Mogadishu radio station was one of the first public radio stations in Somalia, and actually it predated the independence. It was established in late 50s by the Italian colonial powers. It was established not only in Mogadishu, but also in Hargeisa, and the first TV broadcast in Somalia was 1983. Now, recently, after the Civil War, a lot of small radio stations were established in major cities, with a number of them in the capital, Mogadishu. As always, majority of Somalis used to rely BBC Somali as the source of news and information, even though that broadcast obviously is a British broadcast corporation based in London. But every time the news from BBC comes in, people would listen with keen interest to know what's happening in their own country and their own backyard. Recently, or recent years, a lot of small websites run by members of diaspora were established. They're always people who might not necessarily know about impartiality and unbalance of news. They could side with one point of view or one side of politics. So trusted news about conflict in Somalia was hard to come by. Now, state media and the way we describe state media and the way we describe public broadcaster, for instance, if I compare and contrast, which some people may say, oh, you cannot compare Somalia with, say, countries like Australia. So in Australia, we have two public broadcasters, one being SBS, where I work, and the other one is ABC. Now, the word public broadcaster essentially means a broadcaster that works for the public. It's state funded, so the government funds it, but the government does not control the editorial news and what it delivers to the public. I'm taking up this because I want to talk about the Somali public broadcaster. We have SNTV and a national radio station. But the way it operates is totally different than the way public broadcast in Australia, for instance, would work. So one good example is if you're running Somali national television, oppositions are not given a chance to express their views. There is no use of principle of contested ideas as democracy requires. It always promotes the government programs and policies. It works essentially as an arm of government and comes under the Ministry of Information. Now, if I give you an example of how that would be different in Australian context or a real democratic perspective, one of the biggest broadcasters here in Australia is ABC, a $1 billion media company, one of the biggest in Australia. There was a current affair program, one of the flagship programs on television just a couple of weeks ago, discussed essentially the topic was about harassment. It was talking about women, young women who work under powerful men who sometimes feel they are used and abused. This particular program was covering two current ministers who allegedly had affairs with young women in their offices. Now, the program was criticized because they said, how would that be of public interest when you talk about private lives of ministers or politicians? Now, obviously, the public broadcaster will justify it, will defend their stance and how important the program was. Now, the government or the current government where these two ministers work could not shut down the broadcaster, would not arrest the journalist who put together the program, is not able to sanction the broadcaster. So the only thing the government did was to send a letter to the head of ABC and ask them, how was that program come under the public interest? How was it the public interest that you talk about private lives of those ministers? That's the only thing the politicians, the prime minister and the ministers could do. So that contrast is how we understand in Somalia how public broadcasters should work, where it essentially works as a propaganda machine for the government. And again, I have to stress, I'm not talking about this particular current government. That's essentially how the public broadcasting was viewed in Somalia. So it only works for the government, which should not be the case. So there's no editorial independence, there is no integrity, and material are not necessarily factual. That was a little bit about the public broadcast and how it works in Somalia. Now, there are also privately run media, particularly there are quite a few televisions. A lot of them come out of London. They're based in London. And the reason why they based obviously was when they were established maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the country was still under civil war and it was not safe for those media companies to have a studio and offices in the country, but some of them still there. Some of them are actually moving to the country now because the situation has slightly improved. Now, the issue with the private run media companies is they're more interested in generating revenues than public interest programs. So as an example, you will see a lot of private events. It could be a clan meeting, a tribe meeting who may have grievances on the politics or the state government or federal government, or they miss out on on government positions. So whatever the case may be, and you can see those things more and more as the institutions of the country are not being built, or you can see, for instance, the clan meeting increasing, and more you hear more or less, or you don't hear a lot of public interest forums. And I have to say those private television hold a lot of panel discussion, political panel discussions, a lot of good interviews, a lot of debates. But what's still missing is a lot of in-depth analysis of what's happening in the country. There's not a lot of investigative programs. And I can understand that, because the fact is, they want to pay the bills, so whoever pays them will actually have programs. Now, the other issue with a lot of media in Somalia is there is essentially, there are not a lot of editorial responsibilities. There are not a lot of charters. There are not a lot of legal responsibilities. Countries like Australia, you have very strong and robust legal responsibilities for the media. So there are defamations, there are conflict of interest, there are privacy, there are a lot of things media have to look out for before they put out a program. These guidelines and rules and regulations essentially do not exist in Somalia. And in some cases, you look at social media and you see if there were cases where a bomb will explode in Mogadishu, for instance, and there are a lot of dead and destruction. And a lot of those young journalists with camera would come in with no restriction, would take photo of dead people, body parts, and you would see those pictures online straight away. And it's really sad to see that there are no rules, there are no editors or producers who would say that's not acceptable. There might be a grieving family who may see those body of their loved ones online or on Facebook. There is no code of practice. There is no benchmark for what you can publish and what you cannot publish. They're under no obligation to follow certain rules. In developed countries like Australia, you would have, there is in-house lawyers in every organization. For instance, SBS, where I work, if I have questions, or I'm not sure whether an interview I've just conducted can go on air, or if there is any legal issues, I can just pick up the phone and talk to them and explain what the situation is, and I will get an advice straight away. All these things do not exist in our country, in Somalia, I should say. Now, the other most important thing for media in general is the need for accuracy, impartiality, and balance of what you're putting out, the news and current affairs. Essentially, these are also, for most part, non-existent in Somalia. And I was just saying about the graphic pictures of maybe dead bodies. There are no, they lack in classifications. In here, you have sometimes warning of violence, warning of graphic pictures, and so on. Maybe something of a sexual nature. These things, because of the conservative nature of our society, are not particularly issue, but violence and graphic pictures are. There are no complaint systems, for instance, in our media. BBC and VOA Somali play a big part in media and information and news delivery in Somalia. Obviously, they're foreign entities, but well established, particularly BBC. BBC was established in 1956 by memory, and was a very, very, very reliable source of information for Somalis for many years. VOA joined the frame later on. These organizations are good in holding debates, panel discussions, forums, and interview. But their in-depth analysis, in a way, are limited because maybe there's not enough reporters and resources inside the country. They're based in Washington and London, obviously. Now BBC is based in Nairobi. The other thing, or the other barrier to those organizations probably is the fact that they're not based in the country, so their investigative capacity may be limited. I just mentioned the area where the media in the country is lacking. There are no, for instance, license conditions to many of those media organizations. So first world countries like Australia, the media is generally regulated by Australian Communication and Media Authority, for instance, in Australia. So if you breach some of these licensing conditions, you could lose the whole organization. There are also ethics and morals and community expectations. There are also regulatory bodies that oversee radio, TV, broadcast, and internet in Australia. So, for instance, in Australia or most of the Western nations, if you were to post something online and that you play with